May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, God, our strength and Redeemer. For the past 2 years, I've worked at an anti-hunger nonprofit called Why Hunger. And as I've told some of you, one of my main tasks at work is to answer calls on the National Hunger Hotline. Our goal is to help people who are hungry find food, and the calls we get really run the gamut. Sometimes people will ask how to apply for food stamps or where the closest food pantry is, that sort of thing. But sometimes I get a call that's a lot harder, and I just can't forget it. And one of these calls was from a guy named Robert, who called me last thing on a Friday afternoon before we closed for the weekend. And Robert, he started by apologizing and saying, I'm sorry I'm calling. I've never asked for any help before. And so he told me that, usually he's the one who's giving, and so it was very awkward and difficult for him to call and ask for help. He was 60 years old, which was at the time the same age as my parents, so I kind of felt that connection. And he called me because things had gotten really bad. He lives in Washington State with his wife and gets about $1,000 a month from his disability check, and that's what they have to live on. And so he told me that they had run out of food, and they started eating dog food. And then they ran out of dog food, and that's when he called me. So, I told him how to apply for food stamps and tried to connect him to food pantries in his area, but the thing that really struck me about his situation was how long he had waited to ask for help because he was so deeply, deeply ashamed about being poor. And it wasn't just the stigma of, being poor, the paradigm that people who receive government benefits they're worthless, they're moochers. Robert told me that he always believed that you reap what you sow, but then he said to me, but I didn't sow this. And he told me that he didn't drink, that he had always lived a very good moral life, and so he was at a complete loss as to why God would be punishing him. And so it really dawned on me that poverty had affected him not just on a physical level, but on a deeper and more painful spiritual level. Prosperity gospel tells us that if we're good, God will reward us financially. And because Robert wasn't being rewarded financially because he and his wife were stuck eating dog food and had just run out, then in God's eyes, he must have done something wrong, except he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. So he felt like God had abandoned him the way that Job felt abandoned. And so I did my best to comfort him and to encourage him to get help. I told him, you've paid it forward over the years, and so, it's okay for you to get help now. But for every call that I get, like Robert's call, I get dozens and dozens of other calls from people who have already asked for help and just aren't able to get it. There's a mom from central Pennsylvania named Cindy, and she's divorced. She's a single mom, and her son is severely autistic. She doesn't work because she needs to take care of him. She can't find a job that pays her enough to find the care that he needs, so she has to stay home and take care of him. And her ex-husband was deadbeat dad, didn't pay the child support for quite some time until they finally garnished his wages. And she got all of that money. They garnished it, and she got all that money at once. But what happened then is she went over the income limit for food stamps. So because she got all of that money at once, she lost all of her food stamps and didn't have any money to buy groceries for her son. So the only thing she could do was go to a food pantry. The problem, though, was that her son, because of his autism, is a very picky eater and only eats certain foods, one of which she explained to me is this Kraft macaroni and cheese, but it's not the regular kind. It's white cheddar, and it has like a very special noodle shape, and it's the only one that he will eat. And it costs $1 more than the regular box, but she has to buy it because, he's really skinny, and if he doesn't eat, he'll, it's just bad for his health. So, I know that it's going to be really hard for her to find that particular macaroni and cheese in a food pantry because they don't take special orders. You know what I mean? You go there, you get everyone else's leftovers, and the idiom we always use is beggars can't be choosers. I'm not sure, maybe some of you read the 5-part New York Times piece about Dasani. Did anyone read that? And she's a homeless girl who lives under really terrible conditions at a shelter in Fort Greene. And did anyone hear Mayor Bloomberg's response? He said, this kid was dealt a bad hand. That's just the way God works. Sometimes some of us are lucky and some of us are not. Well, good riddance, Mayor Bloomberg. De Blasio also addressed the story at a press conference, and he said, if you ever needed an illustration about what the Tale of Two Cities is all about, there you have it. And this rhetoric about the two New Yorks has been very effective for de Blasio. He uses it on his website. It allows him to self-identify as a bold progressive, a progressive with a capital P. I actually met de Blasio this summer while he was campaigning, and I shook his hand and I asked him, so what are you going to do to make New York more affordable? And he told me about his plan for affordable housing, and I was not impressed. In retrospect, I probably should have asked him, what are you going to do to make New York more affordable for me? You see, I don't feel like I'm part of either of de Blasio's two New Yorks. I know I'm better off than Dasani's family, but a simple walk down my block reminds me that I'll never be able to afford the brownstones or the luxury apartments that have doormen that my neighbors live in. And I'm not just, a spoiled millennial crying about this. This is a real challenge. Just a few weeks earlier, before I met de Blasio, Brian and I got the lease renewal for our 1-bedroom, 4th-floor walk-up apartment in Prospect Heights, where we'd been living for 2 years. And our absentee landlord had raised the rent 9%. So the first thing we did was try to find out if it was legal for him to do this, and it was. So then we asked him if we could have a 2-year lease, to lock in that rate so it doesn't keep going up. And he said that if we wanted to sign a 2-year lease, he wanted a 15% rent increase, not a 9% rent increase. So, he said it was a good price for the neighborhood. So we went and tried to see if there were any other apartments that were comparable for a lower price in the neighborhood, and they were not. So we ponied up and we signed the lease. And it was one of the first times in my life that I've really felt truly powerless and like I didn't have any control over my life. So I started to compulsively visit real estate websites, and I thought maybe that we could preserve our life here in New York if we could buy an apartment before we were entirely priced out of all of the adjacent neighborhoods. And Brian and I also agreed that we would really knuckle down over the next few years to advance our careers and increase our income so we could get married and buy a place and have kids and provide for them, which is not easy in New York City for a teacher and somebody working at a nonprofit. Brian actually managed to negotiate a raise with his boss, which is great. But last week, they had a meeting at my office, and they told us that despite all of our hard work, there would be no raise this year because, for me or for any of my coworkers, because of the organization's financial difficulties. And on top of that, we just lost all of our benefits too. Health insurance, dental, MetroCard, they're not paying into our 401ks, any of that. So it's felt a little bit one step forward, 2 steps back. And I really worry about our long-term ability to stay here in New York and subsequently to stay here at Judson. And this is my reality, and I wanted to tell you it because it's important to me. And if I hide it the way that Robert hid his financial situation, his dog food eating, if I hide it, it just makes me feel more isolated. So the point I'm getting to by telling Robert's story and Cindy's story and then my story is that charity and policy alone are never going to end hunger or poverty or economic injustice. Charity as a response to hunger is not only inadequate, but it robs people of their dignity. And our social safety net, which includes food stamps and other programs, does offer more to low-income families than charity, but it's still a broken system that stigmatizes people, and it really fails to create lasting change. This month, Congress will likely pass a farm bill that, in these hard economic times, cuts food stamp funding by $9 billion over the next decade. So what do? We can't give up on charity, and we can't give up on progressive policy change. And we have to keep on doing these things in ways that promote dignity, and with the acknowledgement that hunger is a symptom of economic injustice, and to address hunger, we have to address systemic issues like the cost of housing, healthcare, education. We have to look at living wages. We have to look at sexism and racism and other isms. But to be radical, for us, for Judson to be radical, like Michael Ellick told us in last Sunday's sermon, we need to take things a step further, not just charity, not just policy. We have to follow in the footsteps of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who named poverty, along with racism and militarism, as one of the triple evils. And we have to live in beloved community with each other. King wrote, "The well-off and the secure have too often become indifferent and oblivious to the poverty and deprivation in their midst. No individual or nation can be great if it does not have a concern for the least of these." The least of these, another bit from the New Testament, which doesn't fall too far from today's reading. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it, and if one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. So to be in community, we have to acknowledge our differences and embrace plurality. I don't mean just outside these walls, I mean within these walls too. The Dickensian either-or nature of describing ourselves as haves or have-nots, rich or poor, 99% or 1%, inside Judson or outside Judson, it homogenizes us within our particular category, and it silences our different gifts. There are more than 2 New Yorks. There are as many New Yorks as there are parts of the body, and many of these parts, if not all of them, are represented here within Judson. The last thing I have to say is that before we adopt the phrase, Judson is for the people who aren't at Judson, perhaps we should pause to ask ourselves what that implies. What does it say about who we are, who they are, and whether it's okay for us to admit that we're a community, a church that's also here for ourselves? Amen.